Imagine going to 4 or 5 different stores just to buy dinner. A butcher for your meat, a baker for your bread, a separate shop for your canned goods, and another for your produce. For most Americans living in the early 20th century, that was simply the way things were done. The idea of walking into one large store and finding everything you needed under a single roof would have seemed almost unbelievable. And yet, within just a few decades, that is exactly what happened. In the early 1900s, American towns and cities were filled with small, specialized shops. The general store served as the heart of many rural communities, carrying a mix of dry goods, hardware, and basic staples. In larger towns, families would make their rounds, stopping at the butcher, the fishmonger, the dairy, and the local grocer, each of whom knew their customers by name. Those small grocers operated in a way that feels almost foreign to us today. You did not simply walk in and help yourself. Instead, you would step up to a long wooden counter and hand the shopkeeper your list or tell him what you needed. He would then gather your items for you from the shelves behind the counter, weigh out the flour or sugar, wrap the cheese in paper, and add up your total by hand. It was a personal experience, and in many ways, a trusting one. Many customers ran tabs, paying at the end of the week once the husband's paycheck came in. The system worked reasonably well for generations, but it had real limitations. It was slow. It depended entirely on the shopkeeper's time and attention, and because every item had to be retrieved and handled by a clerk, stores could only stock so much. Prices were set by the owner, and there was little competition on any given block. If you didn't like the price, your choices were limited. By the early 20th century, a few forward-thinking businessmen began to wonder if there was a better way. The story of the modern supermarket really begins in 1916 in Memphis, Tennessee. A grocer named Clarence Saunders opened a store he called Piggly Wiggly, and it changed everything. Saunders had a simple but radical idea. What if customers were allowed to walk through the store themselves, pick up their own items, and bring them to a cashier at the front? No waiting for a clerk, no reciting a list, just the customer, the shelves, and their own 2 hands. This concept, what we now call self-service, sounds so obvious to us today that it is easy to forget how revolutionary it truly was. At the time, letting customers wander freely through a store, touching and selecting their own merchandise, was considered by many in the trade to be chaotic, even dangerous to business. Who would stop someone from taking something without paying? How could you control what people put in their baskets? Saunders had thought carefully about this. He designed his Piggly Wiggly stores with a specific layout in mind, a winding, guided path through the shelves that led customers naturally toward the checkout counter at the exit. Every product was clearly priced and labeled. Customers could see exactly what they were getting and exactly what they would pay. There was a kind of honesty and clarity to it that appealed to people immediately. The results were striking. By removing the clerk from the equation, Saunders was able to lower his prices and his operating costs dropped because he needed lesser employees. And for the customers, they were free to browse at their own pace. Piggly Wiggly became a franchise almost overnight, spreading to hundreds of locations across the country within just a few years. Other grocers took notice. Through the 1920s, chain grocery stores began spreading across American cities. The Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known as A and P, had been operating since the 1800s, but it embraced the self-service model and expanded rapidly, eventually becoming the largest retail business in the country. By the end of the decade, chain grocery stores were a familiar fixture in most American towns. But there was still one more step to take. In 1930, a man named Michael Cullen opened a store in Jamaica, Queens, that many historians consider the first true supermarket. Cullen called it King Cullen, and it operated on a scale that made even the largest chain grocery stores of the time look modest by comparison. Where a typical grocery store of the era might carry a few hundred items, King Cullen stocked thousands. It occupied a large, no-frills warehouse space, offered rock-bottom prices made possible by buying goods in enormous quantities, and it was designed from the start to attract customers who would drive to it, load up on a week's worth of goods, and drive home. This was the supermarket model, large, affordable, diverse, and built around the automobile. King Cullen ran newspaper advertisements, promoted weekly specials, and drew customers from miles around. The concept spread quickly through the 1930s, even as the country struggled through the Great Depression. In some ways, the Depression actually accelerated the growth of supermarkets. Price mattered more than ever, and the sheer buying power of a large supermarket allowed it to offer prices that smaller shops simply could not match. By the late 1930s, supermarkets were multiplying across the Northeast and Midwest. Traditional grocers watched with alarm, and many trade organizations campaigned against them, arguing they were destroying local businesses and community ties. They were not entirely wrong. Thousands of small specialty stores and corner grocers did close in the years that followed. But American shoppers, drawn by lower prices and greater convenience, kept filling the parking lots of these new large stores. The real transformation, however, came after the Second World War. When American soldiers came home in the mid-1940s, the country entered one of the most dramatic periods of growth in its history. Millions of young families moved out of cities and into newly built suburbs. Developers like William Levitt built entire neighborhoods almost overnight on land that had been farm fields just years before. These new suburban communities were designed around the car with wide roads, driveways, and parking lots, and that made them perfect for the supermarket model. Builders and retailers worked almost in tandem. A new subdivision would go up, and not far behind it, a new supermarket. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s, supermarkets grew steadily larger. They expanded from a few thousand square feet to 10, 20, even 30,000. Parking lots stretched wide and flat beside them. Shopping carts, another invention of the late 1930s, became larger and deeper, encouraging customers to buy more in a single trip. It was during this same period that American food manufacturing was changing rapidly. Food companies had invested heavily in processing and preservation technologies during the war, and they now turned those innovations toward the civilian market. Frozen foods, once a novelty, became a standard supermarket staple through the 1950s. Brands like Bird's Eye and Swanson filled supermarket freezer cases with everything from vegetables to complete dinners. Packaged and canned goods multiplied. Breakfast cereals, bottled salad dressings, cake mixes, and instant coffee crowded the shelves. The supermarket became not just a place to buy food, but the primary connection between American families and the modern food industry. What you ate was increasingly shaped by what brands chose to make, how they packaged it, and where they placed it on the shelf. By the time the 1960s came to a close, the supermarket had become one of the defining institutions of American life. Families organized their weeks around the weekly shopping trip. Suburban mothers, who were, in that era, most often the ones managing the household's food supply, became skilled navigators of the supermarket floor, comparing prices, clipping coupons, and steering loaded carts through wide, fluorescent-lit aisles. The stores themselves continued to evolve. By the 1970s and 80s, many supermarkets added in-store bakeries, delis, floral departments, and pharmacies. Some grew into the category we now call superstores or hypermarkets, combining a full grocery selection with general merchandise, clothing, and housewares. The line between a grocery store and a department store began to blur. Today, the average American supermarket carries somewhere between 30 and 50,000 individual products. A single store might employ hundreds of workers and serve thousands of customers each week. The supply chains behind those shelves stretch across the country and around the world, connecting a shopper in Ohio to a farm in Chile or a factory in Southeast Asia. The small butcher shops and corner grocers did not entirely disappear, but they became exceptions rather than the rule. What had once been a daily ritual of visiting familiar shopkeepers became a weekly errand, efficient and largely anonymous. The supermarket is so thoroughly woven into American life now that it is easy to forget how recently it arrived. Barely a century has passed since Clarence Saunders first let his customers help themselves. In that short time, one quiet but profound idea, the idea that a person should be free to walk through a store, choose their own food, and pay at the door, grew into an industry that feeds a nation. If this kind of storytelling appeals to you, we would be glad to have you along for more. Feel free to subscribe so you never miss a new video. And if it brought back a memory, a supermarket from your childhood, or a corner store that used to stand in your neighborhood, we would love to read about it in the comments below.